The letter arrived on my 28th birthday, delivered by a law firm I'd never heard of in a town I barely remembered. 20 years had passed since I'd last set foot on my grandparents' ranch in Montana, and honestly, I'd assumed the place had been sold off decades ago. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and when I opened it, I found documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my childhood and the family I'd lost. I was 8 years old when social services took me away from the ranch. My parents had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, and my grandparents, Martha and William Hayes, had taken me in without hesitation. I remember those 6 months as some of the happiest of my childhood, despite the grief. The ranch was enormous, stretching across 400 acres of rolling hills and grassland, with horses, cattle, and more space than a kid could explore in a lifetime. My grandfather taught me to ride, to mend fences, and to appreciate the quiet beauty of Montana sunrises. My grandmother baked bread every morning, and the smell would wake me up better than any alarm clock. Then one day, everything changed. Social workers showed up with police officers, and I was told that my grandparents were unfit to care for me. The reasons were vague, something about their age, their health, their ability to provide proper supervision. I remember crying and screaming as they put me in the car, watching my grandmother collapse in tears on the porch while my grandfather held her. I never saw them again. Letters I sent were returned unopened. Phone calls went unanswered. It was as if they'd simply vanished from existence, taking with them the only real home I'd known after my parents died. The orphanage in Seattle became my new reality. It wasn't terrible as these places go, but it wasn't home. I aged out of the system at 18, put myself through community college, and eventually built a decent life as a freelance graphic designer. But there was always this hole in my heart, this unanswered question about why my grandparents had abandoned me so completely. I'd convinced myself that maybe they hadn't wanted me after all, that the social services intervention had been a relief to them, a way out of an obligation they'd never really accepted. The letter from the law firm shattered all those assumptions. It informed me that my grandmother had passed away 3 months ago at the age of 87, and my grandfather had followed her just 6 weeks later at 89. The ranch, along with everything on it, had been left to me in their will, but there was more. Attached to the legal documents was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, written apparently just days before her death, explaining things I'd never known and revealing secrets that had been kept from me for 2 decades. According to her letter, my grandparents had never wanted to give me up. They'd fought the social services decision with every resource they had, hiring lawyers and filing appeals, but they'd lost every battle. Someone with significant influence had been working against them, manipulating the system to ensure I was removed from their care. My grandmother didn't name this person in the letter, but she hinted that it had something to do with what my grandfather had discovered on the ranch shortly before I was taken away. She wrote that they'd been forbidden from contacting me, threatened with criminal charges if they tried to reach out. The courts had issued a restraining order, claiming it was for my own protection, though she swore they'd never done anything to harm me. The letter ended with an apology and a warning. She apologized for not being able to fight harder, for not being able to keep me safe for all the years we'd lost. But she also warned me that returning to the ranch might be dangerous. Whatever my grandfather had found all those years ago, whatever had caused the authorities to tear our family apart, might still be there. She wrote that if I decided to claim my inheritance, I should be prepared for the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. She'd left everything exactly as it had been the day I was taken away, preserving it like a time capsule, waiting for me to come home and discover what they'd been forbidden to tell me. I sat in my Seattle apartment for 3 days, reading and rereading that letter, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to sell the ranch site unseen, take the money, and leave the past buried. But another part of me, the part that had never stopped being that 8-year-old boy who'd been ripped away from the only family he had left, needed answers. I needed to know why my grandparents had been taken from me. I needed to understand what had been so important, so dangerous, that it had cost me 20 years with the people who'd loved me. On the fourth day, I packed a bag, loaded up my car, and started the long drive from Seattle to Montana. The law firm had included keys to the ranch and instructions for accessing the property. According to them, the place had been maintained by a property management company for the past 2 decades, kept in livable condition but otherwise untouched. My grandparents had used a significant portion of their savings to ensure the ranch would be waiting for me, perfectly preserved whenever I was ready to return. The drive took me through some of the most beautiful country in America, but I barely noticed the scenery. My mind was spinning with questions and possibilities, trying to imagine what I might find when I finally arrived. What had my grandfather discovered that was worth destroying a family over? Why had someone with enough power to manipulate social services and the courts wanted me away from that ranch so badly? And after 20 years, would any evidence of the truth still remain, or had time and silence buried it forever? The ranch looked exactly as I remembered it, and yet completely different. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the property and painting the old farmhouse in shades of gold and amber. The 2-story structure stood solid and weathered, its white paint faded but intact, the wraparound porch still welcoming despite decades of emptiness. The barn loomed in the distance, red paint peeling but structure sound, and I could see the outline of the stables where my grandfather had kept his horses. Everything was there, frozen in time, waiting. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine off, just staring at the house. Memories flooded back with an intensity that took my breath away. I could almost see my grandmother on that porch, waving as I came running up from the barn. I could almost hear my grandfather's laugh echoing across the fields as he taught me to rope fence posts. The weight of 20 lost years pressed down on me, and I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself before I could finally open the door and step out onto the gravel driveway. The property management company had left a welcome packet in the mailbox, along with updated keys and alarm codes. According to their notes, they'd maintained the basics, keeping the plumbing functional, the roof repaired, the grounds mowed, but they'd touched nothing inside the house. That had been explicitly stated in my grandparents' instructions. The interior was to remain exactly as it had been, untouched, preserved like a museum exhibit of our interrupted life together. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, just old and musty, the scent of a place that had been closed up for too long. But underneath that was something familiar, something that sent me straight back to childhood. My grandmother's lavender sachets, the leather of my grandfather's old chair, the particular combination of wood smoke and coffee that had always meant home. The living room looked like we'd just stepped out for an afternoon. My grandfather's reading glasses sat on the side table next to his favorite chair. A newspaper from 20 years ago lay folded on the coffee table, its headline announcing some long-forgotten political scandal. My grandmother's knitting basket still held a half-finished scarf in blue and grey wool. Even the family photos on the mantel were exactly where I remembered them, including the last picture taken of the 3 of us together, just weeks before I was taken away. I walked through the house in a daze, each room triggering a cascade of memories. The kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to make her famous apple pie. The dining room where we'd eaten dinner together every night at exactly 6 o'clock. The small room off the hallway that had been mine, still containing my childhood bed, my books, my toys, all waiting as if I might return at any moment. But it was my grandfather's study that drew me like a magnet. This had been his private space, the room where he handled ranch business and kept his important papers. I'd only been allowed inside a handful of times as a child, and always under his direct supervision. The door was closed now, and when I turned the handle, I found it locked. That was odd. None of the other doors in the house had been secured. I tried the keys the law firm had given me, but none of them fit. This lock required a different key, one I didn't have. I stood there for a moment considering my options. I could call a locksmith, but something told me that would be a mistake. If my grandfather had locked this room separately from the rest of the house, there was a reason. If my grandmother had left it that way, preserved through 2 decades of absence, she'd wanted me to find the key myself. This was part of whatever mystery I'd come here to solve. I started searching the house systematically, looking for anything that might lead me to that key. I checked all the obvious places first: drawers, closets, the pottery jar on the kitchen counter where my grandmother had kept spare keys. Nothing. Then I started thinking less obviously, remembering the games my grandfather used to play with me, teaching me to think creatively about problem solving. He'd loved puzzles, riddles, hiding things in plain sight. That's when I remembered the books. My grandfather had been an avid reader, and his personal library filled an entire wall of the living room. He'd had a habit of using books as hiding places, hollowing out old volumes to create secret compartments. He'd shown me once, making me promise never to tell my grandmother about his hiding spots. It had been our secret, a bond between grandfather and grandson. I started pulling books off the shelves, checking each one carefully. Most were solid, normal books, but about halfway through the 3rd shelf I found it, an old leather-bound copy of Treasure Island that felt too light when I lifted it from the shelf. Inside, the pages had been carefully cut away to create a hollow space, and nestled in that space was a small brass key attached to a note written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The note was brief but meaningful. For James, when he comes home. The truth is in the study, but be careful, son. Some secrets are kept for good reasons, and some are kept because powerful people want them hidden. What you find in that room led to us losing you, but it might also lead to justice for people who've been waiting a long time for someone to care enough to look. Trust your instincts, trust what you remember about us, and know that everything we did because we loved you more than our own safety. My hands were shaking as I carried the key back to the study door. This was it, the moment where everything would either make sense or shatter into even more confusing pieces. I slid the key into the lock, heard the satisfying click as the mechanism turned, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, curtains drawn, and I had to fumble for the light switch. When the overhead light finally flickered on, I found myself staring at something I never could have anticipated. The study had been transformed into something that looked like a detective's investigation room. Every wall was covered with papers, photographs, maps, and documents, all connected by strings of different colors, forming complex webs of relationships and connections. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with dates and categories. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with notebooks, each one filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. This wasn't just a study anymore. This was the headquarters of an investigation that had clearly consumed months or even years of my grandfather's life. I can see you're invested in this story, and I'd love to have you join our community as we explore more incredible true stories like this one. If you're finding yourself pulled into James's journey to uncover the truth about his past, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And here's something I'm really curious about. If you suddenly inherited a property with secrets from your past, would you want to know the truth no matter what? Or are some things better left buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives always add so much depth to these stories. Now let's continue with what James discovered in that room. I spent the next 3 hours just trying to absorb what I was seeing. The investigation my grandfather had been conducting was far more extensive and sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. He documented everything with the precision of a trained investigator, creating a paper trail that stretched back not just months but years before I was taken away. Whatever he'd stumbled onto, it hadn't been a sudden discovery. It had been a slow, methodical uncovering of something that had been hidden in plain sight for a very long time. The maps on the wall showed the ranch property and the surrounding area, marked with colored pins and notations. Red pins indicated what my grandfather labeled as incident locations, and there were dozens of them scattered across the map, some on our property, others on neighboring ranches, and several in the small town of Millbrook, about 15 miles away. Blue pins marked what he called connected individuals, with lines drawn between pins showing relationships and patterns. Yellow pins, the most disturbing of all, were labeled simply missing, and there were more of those than I wanted to count. I started with the notebooks, hoping they'd provide context for the overwhelming amount of information surrounding me. My grandfather's handwriting was small and precise, every entry dated and cross-referenced with other documents. The first notebook began innocuously enough, with entries about ranch business, cattle counts, fence repairs, equipment maintenance, the normal day-to-day operations of a working ranch. But about 60 pages in, the tone shifted dramatically. The entry was dated March 14th, 3 months before I was taken away. My grandfather wrote, "Found something disturbing in the north pasture today while checking the fence line near Devil's Creek. The ground had been disturbed recently, not by animals, but by digging equipment. At first I thought maybe surveyors had been out here without permission, but the pattern was wrong. This looked like excavation, then careful refilling and camouflage. I marked the location and took photographs. Something about this doesn't sit right. The property line is clearly marked, and this is definitely on our land, but someone has been working here without our knowledge or consent." The entries that followed documented my grandfather's growing concern. He'd started watching the area, setting up trail cameras to catch anyone who might return. Within a week, he'd captured footage of trucks arriving at night, men with equipment working quickly and efficiently to dig, then fill in holes before dawn. He recognized none of the vehicles or the people, but he noted that they had the coordinated movements of professionals, not amateur trespassers. That's when he started expanding his investigation. He began asking questions around town, carefully, not wanting to alert anyone to what he'd discovered. He learned that several other ranchers in the area had reported similar strange activity on their properties over the past 18 months. Unexplained tire tracks, disturbed ground, the sense that someone had been on their land without permission. But when these ranchers had reported the incidents to local law enforcement, nothing had been done. No investigations, no patrols, just assurances that it was probably just kids or hunters who'd gotten lost. My grandfather hadn't been satisfied with those explanations. He started researching, using the town library to look through old newspaper archives, requesting public records from the county clerk's office, talking to people who'd lived in the area for decades. What he found was a pattern of disappearances that stretched back almost 30 years. Young people, mostly in their late teens or early 20s, who'd vanished without explanation. Some were officially listed as runaways, others were classified as accidents, drownings in the nearby river, hiking mishaps in the mountains, but the numbers were wrong. Too many people disappeared from this rural area compared to similar communities. Someone had noticed that once before, a reporter from Billings, who'd written a series of articles in the early 1990s questioning the official explanations. That reporter had died in a car accident shortly after the articles were published, and the investigation had quietly died with him. The more my grandfather dug, the more disturbing the picture became. He found connections between the disappearances and certain individuals in positions of power. The sheriff, who'd held office for the past 22 years, and who had family connections to several wealthy landowners in the area. A judge who'd presided over multiple cases involving missing persons, and who consistently ruled in ways that shut down further investigation. A group of businessmen who'd formed what they called a community development association that seemed to have unusual influence over local government decisions. What really broke the case open for my grandfather was finding the property records. Using his access to county databases, he discovered that several large parcels of land in the area, including portions that bordered our ranch, had been purchased over the years by shell companies with untraceable ownership. These purchases had happened quietly, without the usual publicity that accompanied major land deals. The companies existed only on paper, with no actual business operations, no employees, nothing but legal entities designed to hide the identity of the real owners. My grandfather had started connecting the disappearances to these land purchases, and he'd found something that terrified him. Many of the missing persons had last been seen near properties owned by these shell companies. Many of the unexplained activities on ranch lands, including ours, had occurred in areas adjacent to or accessible from these purchased properties. Someone was using this network of secretly owned land for something illegal, something that had been going on for decades, and they were willing to eliminate anyone who got too close to discovering the truth. The final notebooks, the ones written in the weeks just before I was taken away, showed my grandfather's growing desperation. He'd tried to take his findings to the state police, bypassing local law enforcement, but his reports had somehow been intercepted and rerouted back to the local sheriff's office. He'd contacted the FBI field office in Helena, but his calls hadn't been returned. He'd even reached out to journalists in larger cities, but no one seemed willing to touch the story. It was as if every avenue he pursued led to a dead end, as if someone was always one step ahead of him, blocking his attempts to expose what he'd found. Then came the entry that made my blood run cold. It was dated just 5 days before social services showed up to take me away. My grandfather wrote, "They know. Someone came to the house today while Martha and James were in town. I found evidence that my study had been searched, papers moved, files disturbed. They were careful but not careful enough. They know what I've discovered, and they know I have evidence. I'm afraid now, not for myself, but for Martha, and especially for James. If they're willing to make people disappear to protect their operations, what will they do to silence an old rancher who's stumbled onto their secrets? I need to find a way to protect my family while still making sure this information gets out. The truth is too important to bury, but James is more important than any investigation. I have to figure out how to keep him safe." The next entries detailed his desperate attempts to secure the evidence and protect me. He'd made copies of everything, hidden them in multiple locations, sent packages to lawyers with instructions to hold them until certain conditions were met. He'd written letters to federal authorities, to advocacy groups, to anyone he thought might be able to act on the information if something happened to him. But he'd also realized that as long as I was with them, I was leverage that could be used against him and my grandmother. The people behind this conspiracy could threaten me to keep him silent. That's when I understood what had really happened 20 years ago. My grandfather hadn't been deemed unfit to care for me because of his age or health. He'd been deliberately targeted by people who wanted to silence his investigation. They'd used the system to take away the thing he cared about most, knowing that without me, without that vulnerability, he might be more manageable. They'd isolated him, removed his motivation to keep pushing, and created a situation where continuing his investigation would serve no purpose because the people he was trying to protect were already gone. I sat at his desk, surrounded by 20 years of silence, and felt the full weight of what had been stolen from us. My grandparents had lost their grandson, lost years they could never get back, all because my grandfather had been trying to do the right thing. And I'd lost them, grown up believing I'd been abandoned, carried that pain and confusion through my entire adult life, all because someone with power had decided that protecting their criminal enterprise was more important than a family's happiness. But I also realized something else. My grandfather had been thorough, meticulous, and smart. The evidence he'd gathered was still here, still intact, waiting for someone to find it and finally do something with it. The people who destroyed my childhood might have thought they'd won by silencing him, but they'd made a critical mistake. They'd let the evidence survive, hidden but preserved, and now it was in my hands. The question was what I was going to do with it. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow pins on the map, each one representing someone who'd vanished, someone whose family had been left with questions that were never answered. I thought about my grandfather sitting in this very room, knowing what he knew, feeling helpless to stop it because the people responsible had all the power. I thought about my grandmother, watching her grandson being taken away, knowing the real reason but forbidden from speaking the truth. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I was going to finish what my grandfather had started, but I was going to do it smarter. He'd trusted the local systems and been betrayed. He'd tried working within official channels and been blocked at every turn. I needed a different approach, something that couldn't be intercepted or silenced by people with local influence. I needed to go bigger, louder, and more public than my grandfather had been able to manage 20 years ago. The first thing I did was document everything. I spent the entire next day photographing every wall in that study, every document, every map, every notation. I used my phone, my laptop camera, and a digital camera I found in my grandfather's desk. I uploaded everything to cloud storage with multiple backup accounts, sent encrypted copies to email addresses I created specifically for this purpose, and even burned physical copies onto DVDs that I mailed to trusted friends in different states with instructions not to open them unless something happened to me. Then I started digitizing the notebooks, scanning every page, creating a searchable database of my grandfather's findings. As I worked, I began to see patterns he'd identified but hadn't fully explored. The shell companies that owned the land all traced back eventually to a single holding company registered in Delaware. That company's board of directors included names I recognized from my grandfather's investigation. The longtime sheriff, the judge, several prominent businessmen, and one name that shocked me completely. Robert Calhoun, who was now serving his third term as Montana's state senator and who'd recently announced his intention to run for governor. This wasn't just local corruption. This was a criminal conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of state government, which explained why my grandfather's attempts to get help from state authorities had gone nowhere. The people he'd been trying to expose had connections everywhere, enough power to manipulate social services, to redirect FBI inquiries, to make inconvenient investigators disappear. I knew I needed help, but I had to be careful about who I trusted. Local law enforcement was clearly compromised. State authorities were potentially involved. I needed to go federal, but not through normal channels that could be intercepted. I spent hours researching, looking for the right person, the right office, someone with a track record of taking on corruption cases and seeing them through despite political pressure. That's how I found Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, based out of the federal building in Missoula. She'd made a name for herself prosecuting organized crime and public corruption cases across Montana and Wyoming. More importantly, she'd recently won a major case against a network of county officials who'd been involved in illegal land deals, very similar to what my grandfather had uncovered. If anyone would understand the significance of what I'd found and have the resources to act on it, it would be her. I called her office and, to my surprise, actually got through to her assistant. I explained that I had evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving multiple disappearances, illegal land transactions, and public corruption stretching back 3 decades. I expected skepticism, maybe even dismissal, but instead the assistant asked me to hold. 2 minutes later, Rebecca Chen herself picked up the phone. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice sharp and professional, "your name has come across my desk before. About 18 months ago, I received a package from a law firm in Billings. It was sent per instructions in a will, triggered by the death of someone named Martha Hayes. The package contained a letter explaining that evidence of significant criminal activity was being held at a ranch property, and that this evidence would become accessible when the property's heir claimed his inheritance. That would be you, I assume." I was stunned. My grandmother had found a way to ensure the evidence would reach the right person, even after death. Yes, that's me. I just found my grandfather's investigation. It's extensive, detailed, and it implicates people at every level of local and state government. I need to see everything, Chen said immediately, but not at your location, and not through any official channels yet. These people, whoever they are, have clearly demonstrated the ability to monitor and intercept communications. Can you get to Missoula without being followed? And can you do it today? I looked around the study, at all the evidence my grandfather had risked everything to compile. Yes, but I'm not bringing the originals. I've already created digital backups and sent copies to secure locations. I can bring you a complete set of files on a hard drive. Good thinking, Chen said, and I could hear approval in her voice. There's a coffee shop called The Daily Grind on Higgins Avenue. Meet me there at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone, don't tell anyone where you're going, and if you think you're being followed at any point, abort and call this number. She gave me a different phone number, which I memorized rather than writing down. The drive to Missoula took just under 3 hours, and I spent the entire time checking my mirrors, taking random turns, doing everything I could think of to make sure no one was tailing me. The hard drive with all the digitized evidence sat in my backpack, representing 20 years of silence, finally being broken. Rebecca Chen was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-40s, professional, but with an edge that suggested she didn't back down from fights. She was sitting at a corner table when I arrived, positioned so she could see both entrances to the coffee shop. I slid into the seat across from her, and she immediately handed me a device that looked like a small radio. Electronic counter-surveillance, she explained. It'll detect any listening devices or tracking equipment within range. Your backpack is clean, by the way. I already checked while you were walking over. She'd been watching me before I even entered the building, which was both reassuring and slightly unnerving. I handed her the hard drive, and she plugged it into a laptop that I noticed wasn't connected to any network. She started scrolling through files, her expression growing more serious with each document she opened. After about 20 minutes of silence, she looked up at me with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Mr. Hayes, what your grandfather uncovered is worse than even he probably realized. I've been investigating some of these same people for related crimes, but I had no idea the scope was this extensive or that it went back this far. This evidence, combined with what my office has been developing independently, could bring down an entire criminal network. But I need you to understand something very clearly. The people you're helping me prosecute are dangerous. They've killed to protect their interests before, and they won't hesitate to do it again. Your grandfather and grandmother kept you away from this for 20 years to protect you. By coming forward now, you're putting yourself directly in the line of fire. I thought about those yellow pins on the map, all those missing people whose families deserved answers. I thought about my grandparents, who'd sacrificed everything to try to stop this, and had died without seeing justice done. I thought about that 8-year-old boy who'd been torn away from the people he loved, and the 20 years of pain that had followed. I understand the risks, I told her. But this is bigger than my safety. My grandfather started this investigation knowing it might cost him everything, and it did. The least I can do is finish what he started. These people took my family from me. I won't let them keep destroying other families. Chen nodded slowly, respect evident in her expression. Then we have work to do, a lot of work. I'm going to need you to go through every piece of evidence with me and my team, help us understand what your grandfather found and how it connects. We'll need to verify everything, build cases that will hold up in federal court, and coordinate with agencies that aren't compromised. This is going to take months, possibly over a year. Can you commit to that? I could, and I did. That meeting in a Missoula coffee shop was the beginning of the largest criminal investigation Montana had seen in decades. Rebecca Chen assembled a task force of federal agents, prosecutors from outside Montana, and investigators with no connections to the local area. They brought in experts on human trafficking, organized crime, and public corruption. My grandfather's evidence became the foundation for a massive operation that would eventually involve multiple federal agencies and span several states. But that was just the beginning. The real work, the dangerous work, was still ahead of us. The investigation took 14 months from that first meeting with Rebecca Chen to the day federal agents executed coordinated raids across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. During that time, I lived in protective custody, relocated to a secure apartment in Denver under a false identity, working remotely with the task force to help them understand and verify every piece of evidence my grandfather had compiled. It was the longest, most stressful period of my life, but also the most meaningful. Every day, I was helping build cases that would finally bring justice for people who'd been waiting decades for someone to care. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't contact anyone from my old life, couldn't post on social media, couldn't do anything that might alert the targets of the investigation that someone was building cases against them. Federal agents assured me that the people we were investigating had already noticed my arrival at the ranch and my sudden disappearance, and they were likely trying to locate me. Twice during those 14 months, Chen's team intercepted attempts to track me down, including one instance where someone had hired a private investigator to search for me across western states. But the task force was making progress, real progress. They'd used my grandfather's evidence to obtain warrants for financial records, which led to discovering millions of dollars in illegal transactions. They'd found the bodies of 3 missing persons buried on properties owned by the shell companies, which gave them the physical evidence they needed to pursue murder charges. They'd flipped 2 lower-level members of the organization who provided testimony about the operations in exchange for reduced sentences. The case was becoming unassailable, building momentum like an avalanche that couldn't be stopped. The day of the raids, I watched from a secure location as federal agents arrested 23 people across 3 states. Senator Robert Calhoun was taken into custody at his home in Helena, along with Sheriff Douglas Morrison, Judge Patricia Weston, and 20 others who'd been part of the conspiracy. The charges were extensive: human trafficking, murder, kidnapping, public corruption, money laundering, racketeering, and about 40 other counts that would ensure most of them would spend the rest of their lives in prison. The news coverage was massive. This wasn't just a local crime story. This was a multi-decade criminal conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of state government. And the evidence was so overwhelming that even the most skeptical journalists couldn't question its validity. My grandfather's investigation, preserved for 20 years, became the centerpiece of what prosecutors called one of the most important corruption cases in modern Montana history. The trials began 6 months later. I testified at every single one, sitting in federal courtrooms and telling juries about what my grandfather had discovered, about how my family had been destroyed to silence his investigation, about the evidence that proved these people had been operating a criminal enterprise for over 30 years. It was exhausting and often terrifying, knowing that the people I was testifying against had killed before and might still have connections capable of reaching me. But I never wavered. This was what my grandparents had sacrificed everything for, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The convictions came one after another. Senator Calhoun got life without parole for conspiracy to commit murder and human trafficking. Sheriff Morrison received 85 years for his role in the disappearances and for using his position to obstruct justice. Judge Weston got 60 years for corruption and for dismissing cases that would have exposed the conspiracy. In total, 19 people were convicted and sentenced to significant prison terms. 4 others took plea deals and cooperated with prosecutors, providing even more evidence about the organization's operations. But beyond the convictions, there was something more important. Families who'd spent decades wondering what happened to their missing loved ones finally got answers. Bodies were recovered and returned to families for proper burial. Cases that had been classified as runaways or accidents were reclassified as homicides, and victims' names were cleared. The truth, after 30 years of being buried and protected by corruption, finally came to light. A year after the last trial ended, I returned to the ranch. The property had remained in protective custody during the investigation, but now it was truly mine again, free from the shadow of conspiracy and danger. I stood in my grandfather's study, looking at the walls he'd covered with evidence, thinking about the courage it had taken for him to pursue the truth, even when he knew it would cost him everything. I decided to turn the ranch into something meaningful. Part of it would remain a working ranch, honoring the life my grandparents had built there. But the main house became the Martha and William Hayes Center for Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases and supporting families dealing with missing persons. My grandfather's study was preserved exactly as I'd found it, turned into a museum exhibit that tells the story of how one man's determination to expose the truth eventually brought down an entire criminal network. The center has helped solve 17 cold cases in its first 3 years of operation. We work with families, coordinate with law enforcement agencies that are trustworthy, and provide resources for people who feel like their loved ones' cases have been forgotten or deliberately ignored. Every person we help, every case we solve, every family that gets closure is a testament to what my grandparents believed, that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they refuse to stay silent in the face of evil. I often think about that 8-year-old boy being driven away from this ranch, crying and confused, not understanding why his grandparents couldn't keep him. Now I understand that they couldn't keep me because they loved me too much to let me become leverage against them, too much to risk me being caught in the crossfire of their fight against corruption. They sacrificed our time together to protect me, even though it broke their hearts. That's a kind of love that deserves to be honored, remembered, and continued. The ranch isn't empty anymore. It's filled with investigators, advocates, families seeking answers, and people dedicated to continuing the work my grandfather started. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the Montana sun rises over the hills, just like it did when I was a child, I swear I can feel my grandparents' presence here, watching over the place they loved and approving of what it's become. They started a fight for justice that they couldn't finish, but their grandson, the boy they protected at such terrible cost, was able to complete their mission. Some inheritances are measured in money or property. Mine was measured in truth, courage, and the responsibility to finish a fight that began before I was old enough to understand what was at stake. It cost me 20 years with the people I love most, but it also gave me a purpose that I'll carry for the rest of my life. The ranch isn't just a place anymore. It's a promise kept, a legacy honored, and proof that even when evil seems powerful and untouchable, the truth will eventually find its way into the light. Thank you so much for staying with me through James's incredible journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of truth and the importance of never giving up on justice, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this because they matter, because they remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand up for what's right. Please take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be inspired by James's courage or comforted by knowing that truth eventually prevails. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What did you learn from this story? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between personal safety and doing what you know is right? Maybe you have your own story about discovering family secrets or uncovering hidden truths. Our community is here to listen, support, and share these powerful experiences together. Drop your thoughts below, and let's continue this conversation. Your stories matter just as much as the ones we share here. Until next time, remember that the truth may be hidden, but it's never truly lost. Sometimes it just takes the right person at the right time with the courage to look for it. Thank you for being part of this community.